Welcome to the Arabesque Scissors YouTube channel. I'm Ali Phillips, and in this video I'll take you through how to make the exterior of the Creators Compendium, and this is the cover version we'll be making with the star block on the front. So I'll be taking you through some basic half square triangles, how to sew them together, trim them down, put them together, and finally how to cut your block to size. And also in this video I'll be taking you through how to add this really elegant touch of piping to the edge of your compendium. Now, if you love instructional sewing videos that help you grow in your skills as a sewist, please consider hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like. And if you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future patterns for me, please leave me a comment. So let's get started constructing this cover. So version 1 needs no construction as it's made from a whole piece, and version 2 is also very simple construction. So today I'll be demonstrating this particular version, and when I get to the same point for the other covers, I will be pointing out what we need to know. So just grab your first larger set of squares here, and we're going to be making some very basic half square triangles. So you're going to need a colour 1 and a colour 2 and a background square, and it doesn't matter which colour you call which, you can just decide. So you're going to have 4 each of this size square. So we're just going to start by taking one of the colours and placing it right sides together with a background square. Then just grab a pen and you're going to rule a line diagonally from one corner to the other. Now you can put a couple of pins in here if you'd like to, and then we're ready to take this to the sewing machine. And we're going to stitch on either side of the line at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so there will be 2 rows of stitching. So now you can go and pair up each of your squares here. So you'll need to pair 2 colour 1s with a background each, then 2 colour 2 squares with a background each, and finally 2 colour 1 and 2 colour 2 squares together. And to speed things up, you can chain piece this to get it done really quickly. So then you can go and cut your squares apart, and then we're going to slice these down the middle on that line that we drew at the beginning. So now you can go ahead and slice them all down the middle, and you will have 12 half square triangles. So now you can go ahead and open these out and give them a good press, and everyone's got their own preferred method of pressing. I'm just going to be pressing mine to the dark side. So we'll just run through this again very quickly. So you'll have 4 colour 1 background squares, you will have 4 colour 2 background squares, and you'll have 4 colour 1 and colour 2 squares. So now you're going to trim these down and square them up using your preferred method. So I'm just using a block lock ruler here, and I'm trimming this down to the measurement in the pattern. So now you can just go ahead and square up and cut down all of your 12 half square triangles. You can lay out all of your half square triangles in the grid that's shown in the pattern. And then I like to lay everything out in the correct layout on my design board, so I can take this to the sewing machine and not mess anything up. Now I'm going to chain piece this as one big block, so just take your second column and lay it right sides together on top of the first column and work your way down, just doing that for each of these. So just flip that second column right sides together on top of that first column, and then without turning them you can start sewing down the left hand side one after the other, making sure that you keep these in the same order that you had them on the board. Your string of half square triangles up to where you started and open it out. Then take the first square from the third column, and without turning it, we're going to flip it right sides together onto that first square, and then continue doing that with each subsequent square until you've added the whole of the third column. So now you can open out the squares you've just sewn on, and then take the fourth column, and without turning them, flip them right sides together onto the third column, and then sew these down, adding them onto the third column. So now I'm just going to press my seams open, and you can go ahead and press your seams with your preferred method if you'd like the seams to nest. And now I'm transferring everything back onto my design board. So now you can flip your first row right sides together onto your second row, and I'm just going to pin these junctions together. Now if you've got your seams nesting, you might not need to pin, but I quite like my seams being pressed open, so I'm just going to place a pin into each of these when I've got them lined up. And now you can stitch these two rows together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I like to open my work out and have a little look and see if I'm happy with my junctions, and if I am, I'll just keep going ahead and sewing the next row on. And then finally you can add your last row. So now you can give your block a really good press. I'm going to press my seams open, and then you can admire your beautiful work. So now you can add the first pair of sashings. So we're just going to flip them right sides together onto two of the sides, and then sew them down at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now you can give this a good press and press those seams towards the sashing. Now grab your final pair of sashings and sew these right sides together onto the remaining two sides of the block. Now press your block again, and you can press your seams towards the sashing. Now the final block is actually not square, so we need to trim this to size, and the pattern calls for the block to be 10 1/4 inches wide and 10 3/4 inches tall. And so the amount that you'll be trimming off is going to vary depending on the final size of your particular block. So my block measures just under 11 inches here. So I'm going to need to cut about 3/4 of an inch off each side of my block. So make sure that you do this equally off each side of the width of your block. And if you'd like your star block to be a bit more central on the cover, you can do like I'm doing and just trim down a little bit more on one side than the other. Just make sure that your final amount measures 10 1/4 wide. And now you need to trim the height of your block just down a fraction so that it's going to measure 10 3/4 inches high. So for me this just means trimming off a very tiny amount at the top and the bottom. So now you can grab your back section, and we're going to sew these together. So make sure you have this oriented the way that you would like your back to face. So it's really important here that the front cover is going to be on the right hand side and the back cover is going to be on the left. So that when we fold this in half, like the book will be when it's closed, that your front will be on the front, and when you open it, your back will be on the back. So then just flip your cover right sides together onto the back, and then I'm going to be sewing on the back side because I find it easier than sewing over all those seams. So So now you can press that centre seam open and flip your work over and give it a really good press, and you can admire how pretty your work is looking. Now just check that your work does indeed measure 19 3/4 inches long, and just trim it down if you need to on the back. So now it's time to fuse the front of your work onto the foam, and I've actually got foam that isn't fusible, so I've got an old towel down here and I'm going to be spray basting my foam to stick it in place. So just spread that out nicely on the piece of foam. Then just fold your exterior in half, back on itself, and I'm just going to work on half a section at a time. Now my basting spray is Helmar 101, but you can use whatever is your favourite brand. So just give it a really good spray onto the foam section. Then make sure everything's lining up really nicely, and just smooth that down on top of the foam. And smooth out any wrinkles as best as you can. Now of course if you've got fusible foam, you're just going to go ahead and fuse this according to your manufacturer's instructions. So I'm just flipping this back here and spraying the other side, make sure I'm getting as much of it coated as possible. Out this front section, and I'm trying really hard here not to get any of my seams turning the wrong way here, so everything can stay nice and flat. So now you can go ahead and press this flat, and then we're ready to take this to the sewing machine and baste around all of the edges. So I've got a nice big basting stitch here, and I'm sewing between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So now I'm going to add a little bit of quilting to the front of mine, and I'm just going to be stitching in the ditch around each of these segments. And you can do whatever sort of quilting that you'd like to add to this, but just bear in mind that if you're going to do very dense quilting, this can shrink the top of your exterior a little bit, so you might want to bear that in mind and possibly oversize it before you start. So now we're going to round off the corners on each of these 4 corners on the exterior. So just place your fabric corner template in the corner there, and if you're making any of the other versions here, you're going to want to do this at this step as well. So now we're going to just go and baste inside each of these corner curves just to hold all these layers together. So now I'm just going to go and trim off those corners along the line that we've marked, and also just trim off any extra foam that's sticking out from the fabric. So now we're ready to stitch the piping onto the exterior. So you're going to lay this right side up and make sure your front is on the right and your back is on the left. And if you'd like some help making this really cute piping, you can watch my YouTube tutorial that tells you all about the secrets of piping. So I'm going to start and end my piping on the bottom back cover so the join is as obvious as possible. So just place the raw edge of the piping beginning about halfway along the back cover. Just hold that end in place with the clip. Then grab your scissors, and we're going to be making some little clips into the seam allowance of the piping here to help it curve around the corner. Now we're going to keep clipping to about 1 inch away from the curve of the corner here. And then we're just going to clip into the seam allowance on the piping here, just about 4 or 5 snips, about 1/2 inch apart. And you can see that those little clips just help that open out and bend nice and smoothly around that bend. So just hold that in place with a couple of clips going around that corner there. And then you can work your way along the straight edge here, just adding as many clips as you feel comfortable with. So then just keep working your way around, and when you come to a corner, you're just going to clip into the seam allowance of the piping and then just ease that around. So you're not trying to stretch your piping here, you're just trying to make it probably fairly firm but not super tight, or it will be pulling in after you've sewn it, but you don't want it to be super loose either. Now as you come back to the beginning where you started, we're just going to overlap the ends by about 1 inch and trim it off. And then place one more clip close to where you started, and we're just going to leave this opening open just for now. Now you can take it to the sewing machine, and as you can see I'm not even going to switch to my piping foot here, and depending on the machine that you've got and how well this coats with layers, you might not need to use a zipper foot here, so you can try this out if you'd like to. So I've got my stiletto and I'm going to be stitching directly on top of that line of stitching that's already on the piping. So make sure that you're sewing nice and slowly and that your needle is hitting exactly on this line of stitching. So just use your stiletto here to hold those layers all together and push that foam down so that you're making sure you're getting an accurate seam allowance, and make sure that you're not catching any of those little clips of the seam allowance of the piping as you go around the corner. Now you can see that my piping is actually bunching up ahead of my sewing foot here, so if yours is doing this you can stop and reclip everything if you'd like to make it all move along. But this is perfectly fine if you just make sure everything stays straight and level. Now at the bottom I'm going to leave about 1.5 inch gap from where I started stitching. So I'm going to show you my preferred method for joining the ends of my piping together here. So I've left an opening here of about 1.5 inches, and I've got my ends of my piping overlapping here by roughly about 1 inch. Now on the end of the right hand piping, I'm just going to measure exactly 1 inch away from the end and place a mark. And I'm actually going to trim off on the left hand piece of piping a little bit more. So I want my ends overlapping just slightly less than 1 inch, just a smidge. So I'm just going to trim that down so that now those ends are actually that left end is overlapping just slightly less than that mark that I've made. Now just grab your seam ripper, and starting on the mark that we've made there on the right hand side, we're just going to unpick the stitches down to the end. And make sure you pull them out of the back as well. And then just neaten off that thread tail. And then we're going to open out the piping and pull out the piping cord along the bit that we've unpicked there, and then hold that fabric out of the way, and we're going to trim off 1 inch of this piping cord. So now we have an empty end of piping, and if you push that down again you can see that the left hand side of the piping is now going to butt up exactly on the length of the cord on the right hand side. So now you can open out that piping on the right hand side and fold it in half up to the line of stitches that we unpicked. Now you can take the bottom edge of the piping and lay it level with the raw edges here, then take your left hand piece of piping and lay that inside, and then you're going to fold that top edge down over the top of that left hand piece, and that will nicely hide everything inside. And you can grab a clip and clip those edges together to hold everything in place. And now you've got a really nice neat join that you can just stitch over the top of the first line of stitching and lock everything in place together. And you'll find that this join is actually quite unnoticeable. Stitch this join into place, so I'm just going to start by hand cranking my needle slowly just to make sure that I'm going to hit exactly on top of that line of stitching, and then use your stiletto just to hold all those layers in place and just stitch slowly over that line of stitching here. So joining up that gap and just stitching from one side to the other. So that's the exterior of the cover completed, and now you can set this aside and start working on the internal parts.